Alrighty, hello. Here we are with my coffee and my paper and my pen, ready to do another live stream. I've been answering people's questions by email at the moment. And specifically, I answered a bunch of questions like, can I have a new version of Peak Limiter with a big EQ in the middle of it and stuff? And I used to use your plugins 8 or 10 years ago. Can I have new licenses? So that was interesting. Not to say amusing. Technically, the answer is, well, yeah, you can have licenses. That's actually quite easy to do. Because the way it works out is they just work. I think it's good for plugins to just work. I'm checking to make sure that my OBS is looking right and that the microphone is coming through. I'm actually doing another one of my little audio captures. I'll be no doubt forgetting that I'm doing that. And then I'll have a nice long FLAC file of extremely candid closed mic Chris in case I ever come up with a way of grabbing samples out of that and using them for something. And to have a new way of possibly using samples, because what I've got now is the old iMac my mom used to use. And I got to take it home, so I've set it up. You'll see that the studio is a little different, or at least if anybody is there, they'll see. If nobody is there, then I'll have a pretty calm and peaceful time talking to myself for a couple of hours. But I bet somebody's going to show up. Usually somebody does. Hey, Bo. Was it you that had the question? Somebody asked me a question on Patreon. They were asking what this mic was. So I told them, I don't think you're going to be able to build one. Yes, it's DIY, but it is the element from a Rode video mic patched into this rather not long enough cord that's powering these headphones as well. And it's on the third ring of the cord with some kind of funny orientation, like either it's got a special resistor in there or it's put in backwards or something. Whatever is necessary to make it work under those circumstances. And it was very delicate fiddly work to get going, so I don't think people would have that high of a chance of making one for themselves, but oh, okay, well then I answered somebody else's question, and that's all fine. I do like it, though. I mean, I would recommend, if you wanted to sort of homebrew something like that, and you were on a budget, because the Rode video mic is not really that expensive, you could get one of those and sort of tear it apart and cannibalize it, because part of it is it's just the exposed element, not the shotgun stuff that goes with it. And it's right up against my mouth like that. The thing with the slightly larger element is it stops it. Hey, Tommy. It stops the mic from having really annoying high frequencies. Oh, cool. Bo is modding mics. Mod them mics. So you're quite welcome, Tommy. They may not always have the minimalism. I really stick with it most of the time. But, hey, Tony. I may very well end up learning to do VST with GUIs and switching over to that for the purpose of doing other plugins that have the graphics and stuff, because I've done stuff like that before. I've never had a solution that works really well for me as far as doing VSTs and Mac audio units and being comprehensible and working on really old computers, because that is the problem I run into with Juice. Juice is a platform that you can use for making plugins across a wide variety of different exports. And it'll do that, but I think it's stuck with very recent versions of things because of all the updating that you've got to do. And you'd have to be using new versions of Xcode, most likely. And you have to understand how it works. And I find Juice completely daunting. There's so much going on there that it's like learning a new computer just to be able to compile things for it. So that's not my strong suit. It may be that somebody will become really good at that and then will decide to port all the Airwindows plugins over to it, in which case knock yourself out. Bo is doing some stuff similar to what I do. I like upgrading electronics and things. You know, I think I had the parts number for that. It's like a telephone coupling transformer with 2 coils off it. I'll take a minute and sort of dig around in my folders. Mic transformers wouldn't be the same thing, which is not to say they wouldn't work. It's just they wouldn't be the same thing. Let me see what I've got in here. There's a KobeCon something. I'm trying to look through a folder of stuff in order to see whether I can find the kind of transformer I used. It could have been that brand name, so let's see what this is. Nope, that's a jack. Actually, that's a plug. 3 coil, not 2 coil. That's why I'm trying to look it up. I know that particular one was not in fact 2 coil, it was 3 coil. 470 APEM is, oh, hello, a Zycon? That might be. Let's look at the. Okay, that's not actually the 3 conductor one. I'm looking at some Zycon audio transformers, the 42TM series, but they're not wired the way that I was looking for. They're wired just primary and secondary. You're looking for basically 600 ohms on all of the different connectors. And the primary is not unusually high or unusually low. The thing about it, though, is that you could be using different transformers as long as they did the right things. It's just that for the purposes of magnetodynamic infundibulator, you're connecting through the windings. So you want a 600 ohm telephone coupling transformer because you're going through them as if they're wires. And if you have lots and lots of windings, that will limit the, I guess I don't have the answer for you. I tried. Unless I got something else in here somewhere, but probably not. Yeah, it's not going to be there. Okay, struck out as far as that's concerned. You're going to have to do what I did and get some transformers and experiment. That seems correct, right? You do what I did rather than getting told what to do by me. But I can tell you this, that making the particular unit like I did, you're going to need to have balanced connections, and you're going to need to have a telephone coupling transformer that is either 600 ohms on the primary and the secondary, or to have the additional coil like what I used in mine. It's a 3 coil transformer, and all 3 coils are 600 ohms. If there are any that are less than 600 ohms, and there's a pair of like shorter windings, you'd use those to patch through. Or some other kind where maybe if it's got a coil with larger windings, what you would do is put the little diode clipping pair on the winding that's larger. Presumably that's going to be the primary. And then the secondaries are going to be both 600 ohm secondaries. It's going to be a 3-coil transformer to do the way that I did it. And then you'll want those to be both, I guess in phase is the way you'd call it. So the push-pull of the balanced transformer is going to make the inductance go the same way for each. So basically you set it up so that you can swap them around, and the one that gives you the highest output is the one that you should use. Because if they're going along with each other, then they'll both be exciting the inductance and you'll get more gain through it. And if they're opposing each other, then they're basically acting as they'll cancel each other out, and I don't believe you'll get as much gain, and you won't be activating the core of the transformer, so the third winding won't do anything. So you want them with the maximum gain out of it, rather than the configuration where they're opposing each other. Although that would have its uses too, in that if you had, especially if you didn't have the third coil and didn't have to worry about activating it, you could have them opposing each other, and that would mean any hum that you picked up would cancel itself out. And it would also be a very effective inductor on the coil, so it would be basically just a filter. It would be a simple inductive filter, and it would be cutting out in a very natural way high frequencies and just toning everything down, making it a little darker. But since it would be done by an inductor that would be also noise canceling at the same time, that would give you a good quality high frequency roll off. It's just that it'd be fairly aggressive of a high frequency roll off. So Tony, you asked, can I make a DAW? No, right now. But since I do open source work and make it MIT licensed, that means that if anybody else is making a DAW like that, I get to use it. And there are other people who do MIT license. For instance, the game engine, Godot engine, Godot. The Godot engine is also MIT licensed. And they're even working on audio stuff at the moment, so it might be a good idea for me to talk to them and be like, oh, hi, here. I have code that you can use and include in your thing. But if anybody is making stuff like that and has a working thing, that means I can fool with it and do my own variation on stuff if I want. Or indeed, draw? What do you mean by draw? Can I draw a transformer? Can I draw the pin out of the transformer? Can I draw the way the coils are supposed to go? I've got my pen and paper handy, so I can certainly draw things if needed. Absolutely I can, and I will. So what we've got is transformers, which are they'll look kind of like this, and they will often have 3 connectors even if the middle pin isn't being used. I guess it's just convenient to build them in, and then you can connect them to perf board or your PC board or whatever. With the kind that I'm talking about, the connections all go straight through like that, except for through coils. So what you get is the transformers inside that look like this. And you've got the pins. Usually you're going to have like a spot on one side where either looking from the top or looking from below, that will reference which pin you're on. And there will be a little schematic inside the transformer. It'll be different for each one. And the inside will be kind of like this. There will be coils. Now, I'm not sure necessarily how the coils are laid out. I always just have to experiment and see what happens by hooking it up in different ways. But if these were all in sync is really not the right word. If they're in phase with each other and you made a connection your input would be there, and you were going through these and then to ground, what you would get would be driving the coils pretty much twice as forcefully, because you'd have the one here, and then this would be in parallel. And since it's doing the same thing, the impedance going in would be half of what it otherwise would be, because you got two wires going through instead of just one. Another way it can be done is to cross some of those out. And if they were still in phase with each other, and these little crossed lines mean that's not there anymore, you'd go through this one, then loop around and go through this one and out. That would make it be in series. And that would mean that the impedance would be twice the impedance that a single coil would be. And that's another way of wiring the sucker up. This is also relevant with regard to guitar pickups and things, because if you've got Gibson pickups, you've got two coils, and they're wired to work properly if you have a magnet between them, and this one side is the plus side and the other side is the minus side, and there's pull pieces along the coil. See, now we have a picture of a guitar pickup. And with the Gibson wires like this, where you're going into one, through the coil, out and back into the other coil, and then out to ground, and that makes it a higher impedance. But Gretsch pickups that are humbuckers run in parallel. So both of the plus goes to both of the coils, and the coils are out of phase and on the magnet just like that, and then both of the coils go to ground. So Gretsch pickups end up being lower impedance than Gibson pickups, even though they're both humbuckers. The more you know. So, I'm getting a question about smooth. This is a good time to explain smooth. I'm going to look up the code in order to answer that question. It's not very long code, and it's not really a compressor. What it's doing is it's tracking slew rate and restricting that. So it's got a set of things going on. And, well, hang on a moment. Maybe it's more like a compressor than I thought. That's interesting. Okay, so it's like a slew compressor, but it's like 5 different slew compressors. here's what it's doing. Is 5 different samples. And like the one that we're on here. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the sample that we're on, and this is the slew rate that we're on. It's sort of keeping track of that. And as I'm just watching that closely to see. So we're measuring the slew rate, the difference between this and this. So it's going to register that, and then it's going to, I got a bit in there that says gain A times equal 1.0 minus chase. That means it does have, I was wrong when I said that it was only a clipper. It is doing compressing, but it's doing 5 simultaneous compressors in series. And so let's see. Don't mind me, just trying to make sense of this crazy code. It's been a while since I've been over it. What the hell? I'll talk about the parts that I understand. We're doing a kind of compression where it's registering only the slew rate, so it's measuring this part, the difference between this and this. And it's going to measure how much gain is in the compression. And I really want to look at this and see what it's doing with chase here. So chase is, no, I don't have any MIDI plugins, not at this time. Chase is your knob 1, so we turn that up to get more. It'll be low. Makeup gain is getting a boost from that, and then also times slider 2, which is your output drive. Ratio is chase times 24 for no particular reason, and then it's divided by overall scale, so it does synchronize with sample rate. And then chase is multiplied by a small amount. So chase wants to be small. I'm looking at the code here for what it's doing. So gain is being multiplied by 1 minus chase. So gain is staying fairly large, but it'll get smaller. And if chase is set high, then it'll be 1 minus nothing. So the gain gets reduced faster the more you turn it up. Then it gets added by that same factor. Combined with 1 minus our slew rate, our absolute slew rate. And let's see what we're doing with ratio, because we've got sine clamp times ratio in here. So yeah, which could be a quite large number. So not really. The important thing is that gain's getting clamped between 1 and 0. So gain can only be less than we started with, or nothing. And if gain is not 1, then our input sample is multiplied by gain. So we're cutting this down based on what this slew compression thingy does. The point here, and one of the reasons that it has the sound that it does, is that we're first doing the immediately previous sample. And then, let's see. We're doing another layer. This is 5 poles of this effect. That's how it's doing what it does. This is not actually 5 adjacent samples being compared to each, because it's actually being done in poles, so they're sequential. I'm doing a really bad job of explaining it, but it's letting me explain it in more English words once I get around to understanding what's actually happening there. And you may not have been asking the hardcore maths of how it works, but essentially what's going on here is it is like a compressor, but it's acting like a compressor that's triggering on slew rather than amplitude. So it doesn't care about amplitude. It only cares about slew. And one of the reasons that it lingers and hangs on to low frequencies, and for whatever reason I've got 5 different layers of that because it makes it smoother, I guess. I think I must have done 1 layer of it and it was really grungy. And I decided, let's do something to make it handle this a little more smoothly. If you've got a waveform that is a waveform that moves around like this, and you've managed to get up to here, and you do smooth, smooth is trying to suppress slew rate. It's compressing slew rate. It's not letting the slew rate build up. What'll happen is it'll stay at a higher sample rate if you've got it cranked way up. So not only does it not want to do high frequency sounds, but you can also make it not want to let go of low frequencies, and that's part of what's happening with it. Essentially, slew is a 5-pole slew compressor, of which I'm not sure anybody has those. I may have just made it up. That's how it goes. And it's really fairly simple. I'm tempted to try to paste some of it into the chat. Let's see whether it works. Yes, it is. It is slowing slew rate. And that is slew rate from anywhere, not just slew rate from... let's see what this does. Boop. Oh, I have too many. Okay, it only lets me have 200 letters, and so that's too many letters. Let's do it in 2 chunks then. 1 and 2. So that is one of the stages in smooth. And you might find that a little baffling. Lord knows I did. But anybody who codes, that's what they would see in the GitHub. And I'll talk you through some of that just a little bit. Maybe not digging too heavily into it, but just what it's doing step by step. Because half the trouble with coding is you can work out what the thing is doing step by step, but then if you don't know why it's doing what it's doing, that didn't help. So clamp equals fab's input sample minus latch sample A. And then clamp equals sine clamp times ratio, and then last sample A equals input sample. What that's doing, and the other ones are much like it, is you are comparing the last sample that you had to the sample that's coming in, input sample. And fabs means use the absolute value. Sometimes I'll have a variable that's called bridge rectifier. What fabs does is this. If this is 0, and you're measuring that, and this is plus numbers and this is minus numbers, and you do fabs, what you will get back is always this. It'll just skip this stuff entirely, get rid of it. And fabs gives you only the positive sides. It makes all the numbers pluses instead of minuses. That's what fabs' job is. So if we do fabs input sample minus class sample A, what we get is just the slews, just the changes between samples, which is probably going to be a lot smaller unless there's a very loud high frequency noise going on. And since this minus can also be negative numbers, like 1 minus math. 2 minus 1 is 1, and -2 minus -1 is, I think, also -1. -2 minus 1 is 3. You can start getting, fabulous abdominals. I don't get to show you my fabulous abs, not on YouTube. I have to go to some other website. The next bit is the sine clamp times ratio. Ratio was a rather large number. So what happens is clamp ends up, it's smoothing out what it does. Sine does this. If your number is coming in like this and it's getting larger and larger ad infinitum, what the sine function does is it starts flattening it out and then even going back down again. Because the sine function does the thing where it'll take a number that just keeps increasing and turn it into essentially a sine wave. So you'll get that out of it. If your number just increases infinitely, and you sine it, it'll go like this. If you did what I did and multiply it by something, so the number is going up faster, what you'll get is a faster sine. It'll be on the same scale. It's not smaller, but it'll give you a higher frequency that way. And you can generate tones this way simply by taking the sample number that you're on and applying a sine to it in some kind of way will generate a frequency. And if you multiply it or divide it, it'll change the frequency of the sine. You can generate tones that way. I could do that in a regular plugin. It would actually work, assuming that you have the sample number, because you can't just take a buffer number. If you've got a bunch of buffers coming in and they're like this big, and you did the sine thing, you could end up with it going kind of like you'd be making something which went like that, because if you were starting over every time, you'd be getting a break in it. You'd be resetting it to 0 and then starting the sine again, and then resetting it to 0 and starting the sine again. And that is essentially the same thing as oscillator sync in synthesizers. So are you asking why doesn't smooth cut out the bass? Because that's the thing, is if we're talking about smooth, I assume you're talking about smooth, and why doesn't slew restriction cut out the bass? Bass is much slower frequencies. You can make bass frequencies happen with very little slew. Like if I've got waveform, and that's a normal waveform, and then I also have some bass. Let's see, bass. It's just going wave, big slow wave. this is the normal speed of the wave. Bass goes much slower than that. It takes up all this extra space. But you'll notice that none of the angles it's at are sharp. Like these are sharp angles. If this was loud high frequency stuff, you could have very sharp angles, almost vertical. But bass doesn't use that kind of, I mean, if you had bass with angles that sharp, it would be impossibly loud. The lower frequency bass is at the same amplitude as higher frequency waves, the more space it takes, sort of horizontally. And you can see this in a DAW. Go and look at the waveform in the DAW, and you look at bass waveforms, and they'll stretch out much longer than high frequency waveforms. What that means is if you're using slew limiting or compressing, like smooth, which eliminates this stuff, eliminates the high frequency stuff, eliminates the sharp corners, it will allow the low frequency stuff to persist. Or even if you had low frequencies, this is how it generates the simulated bass. If your waveform went down like this again, see, we went back closer to 0 because it started doing this slow thing, and then it's like, Smooth will take this and refuse to let it take that corner. It'll be like, okay, we're going back here eventually. And that is synthesizing bass energy that didn't exist. So Smooth is capable of synthesizing bass, and it's kind of the same for one corner clip. Not really, because one corner clip isn't really there to cling on to waveforms that are like up close to bass and not let them go back to 0 again. One corner clip will kind of just slow the onset to things. But Smooth, by contrast, will hang on to those things. I suppose you could theoretically combine both. I'll make a little note to myself of that. Like, okay, combine one corner clip first. And then Smooth to hang on to bass frequencies when you're not supposed to, and we'll synthesize bass that way. I do have other work that I'm supposed to do rather than just experimenting with stuff like this, but hey, as long as I make a note about it, I'll make some notes on what I'm doing, and then we'll see whether we can artificially fabricate bass where it did not exist. And I'm going to bounce off of Chris's question momentarily. Visual glitch, art process, pixel sorting. No, not really. I don't know what... I've seen some visual glitch stuff, but I don't understand what that has to do with pixel sorting or how it would apply to audio, so I don't actually have an answer for that. As for Smooth being a high-pass filter, not really, I don't think. Because the thing is, if you're doing something like hanging on to bass that doesn't exist, and then you were subtracting it, which is how you would make a high pass, you'd just be generating bass artifacts that were fake somewhere else, so it wouldn't work as a high pass filter at all. Instead, you'd just be making like noises of some kind that weren't supposed to be there. Yeah, my gut check on that is that wouldn't work at all. It's kind of similar to how, like, I put out Brass Rider, and Brass Rider exists to ride up frequencies of cymbals on drum overheads. So what happens is you can have snares and things come through, even bright sounds, without having them affect anything. And then when you hit a crash, the crash gets ridden up. And the question is like, hey, cool, make it so that you can ride the crash down instead. And I don't... To me, that doesn't make any sense. Because if you were going to have sounds that were coming through preserve regular drum hits and then take the you must understand that these overheads have the drums included in them. And if you were to ride them down instead of riding them up, you'd be burying the drum hits that you're trying to preserve. So it wouldn't actually work the way that the questioner thought that it would. Which is, I suppose, unfortunate, but I also don't understand why you'd be wanting to ride cymbal crashes down when they're hit. It's a weird idea to me. Probably that's just one of those ones where it's like, because why not? Let me copy that link and I'll have a quick look at it, because this is a fine time for me to look at things like that. We'll see if that works. It did. Oh yeah, I've seen stuff like this before, although never quite like that. That's pretty amazing. I can't imagine having anything like that relate to audio. That's not how audio works. So, yeah, intervals and so what it's doing is it is thresholding. Anybody else can go along and look at that as well. I'll talk you through it. So what they're basically doing is thresholding it, finding out what the edges are between intervals, and they seem to be done in columns. We don't have a 2D spectrum. Hey, Coleman Trupp. We don't have a 2D spectrum in audio. We have a single stripe of audio. So there's no good way of defining. You could define intervals in terms of, is the signal positive or negative? And I'll tell you what you'd get, too. And you'd have to have a big old buffer so it could not run in real time. It would be significantly delayed, and that's a bit of a drag. And you'd be limited by the buffer size, so you'd have to have the buffer at least long enough to cover anything that you were doing, and you might run into problems on the buffer boundaries as well. And those are more problems for me rather than problems for the concept. For the concept, you can simply think of, list of samples, and that's the entire length of the song. It's 70 billion samples, and it's all one big length. If you did it by waveforms and chose the side of... See, now you got me thinking about this, that you could do a weird, ugly thing with it. And I have plenty of people following my work who crave weird, ugly things, so it's almost like now I'm compelled to figure out a way of doing it. Suppose you have a waveform across 0 and it's crossed over. And you've got something like this. It's going from here to here. And this is how far you've gone before hitting a 0 crossing. What would happen if you sorted that is you'd wind up with ramp waveforms. So now what I'm thinking is you'd want to sort it from the center because you're approaching a 0 crossing. So what you'd get is something that would start to look like weird triangle waveforms, and you'd be obliterating all the highs, but getting a kind of synthetic, a synthy style waveform. I'm going to need to try this. Thank you, Chris, because this is something that I would need to try. I'm not sure if anybody else has. I'd be a little surprised if nobody ever did, but you'd get something that would be kind of like a triangle wave along whatever your 0 crossings were, only not. because it would be sensitive to your amplitude. Like if it was very small amplitude, that would be one thing. And also if you had a signal that went like what you would get is something where, if you had a peak here, but it was in the same old zero crossing area, it would be sorted so that you would wind up with a symmetrical waveform, and it would get more spiky if you had a distribution that was more unusual. Or if it's more like normal audio where, say, you got a waveform and it's more like see, this is where things get interesting. Suppose you've got bass notes in here, and this is a bass note that's coming out of a very simple sine wavy type thing. And we got high frequencies on top of that. If we simply averaged or sorted them, you'd reproduce the sine wave and kill all the highs. That's an interesting output. That's an interesting result. So essentially how that works is the closer you have to symmetrical waveforms, the closer you'll get to getting those same waveforms back out again. And if you fed it like sine waves, you'd get sine waves. And if you fed it a triangle wave, you'd get triangle waves out. And if you fed it a sine wave with high frequency noise, you'd get a sine wave out without high frequency noise, which gets interesting. I think the lower the sine wave, the more effectively it would wipe out all the noise that was in there. And there's no... It really kind of all depends upon the kinds of waveforms you've got. I'm writing pixel sorting down so I know what this was. Pixel sorting. Normally you'll have waveforms that are a lot more colorful there, and if you were to choose to just pixel sort every zero crossing, it'll be retaining high frequencies that are isolated to their own little bins. And then all the lower frequency stuff, it'll be progressively whacking all of the... What it'll do is it's going to try to take any single piece of the waveform, any single piece of the zero crossing, much like you'd be able to do a peak limiter that's looking at isolated areas between zero crossings and scale them. But yeah, there are some interesting possibilities here, Chris. What would you call this? If it was possible, what would you call this? I'll give it a name and I'll let you give it a name. We'll come up with a name together. And then if it works, it'll exist and it'll be something that you named. So what it would do if it was functional and if I made it in such a way that it could work, I'm not sure what kind of buffer I would need to have. It might become kind of silly. Is feed it monophonic instruments and it will return the symmetrical or sine wave versions of those instruments. So you could like feed an electric bass through it, and you'd be getting whatever notes you had at exactly the amplitudes that you had them. But and no, it's sorting by individual pixels. Or the pixel one is sorting by pixels and it's sorting one directionally. With this, you would definitely want to sort from the middle out to the outside edges. And the outside edges would be the quietest ones, and the middle ones would be the loudest ones. Yeah, one of the things about naming things is you don't want to use the actual technology because it won't make sense to anybody and it won't be memorable. It's going to try to create sine waves out of things. Let's call it after noses. Can we call it sinus? It's kind of funny, and it sounds like sines, so that might work. I mean, if I can't make it work, it's a moot point. But if I can't make it work, that's what it would do. So yeah, hey, scene of action. I'm glad you're using some of that stuff. That's what it's there for. And if you can support it in Patreon, I truly appreciate that. That lets me do bigger and bigger things. Like, if I get huge amounts of support on Patreon, it'll mean that I'll be doing more streams and stuff. Like, I'll do streams we'll listen to vinyl records that I've got and analyze how the engineering of those was done, because I've spent a lot of time reading about the production of music, especially the kind of music off of my vinyl records and stuff. That's usually where you're finding a lot of tell-all stories about things, like Jeff Emmerich's book about recording the Beatles. Okay, well, it may end up being sinus. We'll see. The thing that I like about that idea is, upon realizing that, hey, if I fed it a simple waveform like a triangle or a sine, you'd get the same thing out again. That's what makes it interesting for me. And of course, I suppose there is also the possibility of doing that and then subtracting it. And that'd be interesting, because that would leave you with grit and grain and irregularity. So we shall see. And the thing about that is that it would be subtracting the smooth fundamental of the tone, no matter what frequency it was. Yeah, the subtracting bit would be kind of like not sinus. So maybe that does work. We'll see. I mean, bear in mind, I have to write the sorting algorithm and write the way of tracking however many samples it takes to do that many. And it's going to be hellacious latency, possibly quite unpredictable latency. And there's also the case of like whether it goes beyond the buffers or doesn't data properly or whatever. Like you bump the microphone and suddenly you've got a 2 hertz signal, and then the plugin dies because it has to sort more numbers on that one bump than exist in its buffer. So I don't know how feasible this is. It seems like it should be feasible. If they can do that for video or pixels, images, then you could do it for audio. And if I do it in this particular way, that would be very effective. It sure makes interesting images, this pixel sort thing. It's changing the image around quite radically. Like this image right at the top looks like it's taking a waterfall scene, but it seems to have butchered it so much that I can't tell whether that's actually a waterfall or whether there was something completely else going on. So, But yeah, that I would say that was a worthwhile digression. And it'll be interesting to see whether anything comes out of that, because it is a very interesting behavior to have in an algorithm. It pretty much comes down to whether I can make the sorting thing. And maybe that might be something that if I can't handle it, I bet my little brother Dan could. He doesn't know anything about audio and he doesn't know anything about plugins, but he would know how to do that because he does accounting software for a living. And when confronted with the programming problem, he pretty much just drops into low range and solves it no matter what. He is undefeatable in that way. Also, bear in mind, the result of this wouldn't be like a glitch process at all. The result of it would be the wiping out of all overtones, perhaps very effectively. So we'll see. I'll see whether I can do it. Okay, and that is just about our first hour. So what else have we got going on? Have I got other tech support style questions? Because that's one of the things that I'm here to do. Is I think I tried to explain smooth and didn't really succeed very much with it. But I could try to explain smooth again. Honestly, though, there's not that much to explain. It's acting like a compressor. I was wrong about it not being a compressor. It's more like a compressor, but it's a slew rate compressor, and those don't exist, so it's making stuff act weirdly. The challenge, Bo, with novel ways of summing in a mixer is that no matter what you do, you're always at least summing. One of the things that's on my agenda as far as stuff I need to do, and that would be as in fairly urgent, is, oh yeah, I explained smooth better than I understood smooth. One of the things I have on my agenda is combining bus colors with console in such a way that it applies the bus colors processing, the stuff that gives the dynamic behavior in bus colors, that needs to be applied only to the combined signal, so that individual samples, if they are out of phase and resulting in no effect, then that combined effect would be minimal. And that means I have to work out what sort of polarity it needs to be, because I think what would be happening that would make the most positive effect is if you had it so that the loud amplitude samples produce bus colors in its generated convolution thing for high amplitude output, and it's more clipped and it's more distorted, you would have that affecting the combined bus if the bus was high. Whereas if you had other stuff that was out of phase bringing things down, it would apply less of that bus style distortion. I might even be able to exaggerate it. And effectively, I should be able to make it so that you have the convolution of the weaker signal being applied to all of the individual tracks, and then the convolution of the additional whatever is added relating to the louder tracks only gets applied when the signal is high, and it would end up that you'd get the flavor of the console color as it differs from the flavor of the console's convolution impulse. And that color of the thing distorting would only apply when the output was actually high. It makes logical sense. It's just a question of doing it, and it's a question of working out what polarities are required for making that happen. Yeah, this Thursday I'm going and getting some more coffee. I'm running kind of low on coffee, but that's just time constraints and being able to get out to the store and stuff. But I'm looking forward to that. I've been going through a big old mason jar that I have with all of the sort of leftover coffee that I have from bags of coffee beans. If I have them kicking around, sometimes I'll just dump them into a collective jar and be like, okay, so that's the backlog of old coffee, and here's my new bag of coffee beans that's lovely and fresh. And since I haven't had that for a little while, I'm going through the backlog of old coffee beans and probably doing myself out of lovely high quality coffee for a time being. And yeah, that's what I'm talking about, Tony, is new versions of console will interact with console 5 because they'll be based on the same sign and anti-sign, arc-sign routine. And, Chris, tisk tisk. But the thing is, it won't have old bus colors inside because I will have basically identified two parts of how bus colors works. Like, bus colors is currently working like it's got a bit of desk inside it. It's tracking a small window of samples and getting an average of how loud those are. And then it's modulating the change in the convolution based on how loud the samples are for that average. Hey, David. So the new bus colors would not be doing that on a track-by-track basis. It'd be applying the first one, and it'll be a little more efficient that way. It'll be more efficient than having a bus colorist on both the channel and the bus. Instead, the channel version will have just one layer of that, and then the bus version would have the compensation rather than another layer of coloration. And kinda, I'll see whether I can get it to work, right? And one of the things that'll be interesting about that is that will kick off a burst of new work because I'll be porting all of the different models inside bus colors to dedicated console plugins. And then as I do more of them, because it'll be having these be more efficient is very important. It's not good to have like bus colors in every channel because you've got all of this extra code that you're not actually running sitting there on every channel. And when it's something like that, it really matters as to running superfluous code or having extra stuff sitting around. Like, I don't want an extra switch statement sitting in there. I don't want, countless kilobytes of unused code sitting around in a plugin that's on every channel of who knows how large of a mix. But you'd be able to swap out individual channel or bus plugins, including making combinations that aren't supposed to happen. And that is not available in bus colors. So I think it'll lead to people doing a lot of crazy experimenting. I'm looking at you, David. And you would be right. I have actually looked at things like, oh, I don't know, I think it must have been in Google Analytics, but it's the same kind of information like if I was looking at my website download things. And you look at the downloads for which plugins got the most downloads, and console and bus colors always get a lot of downloads. That and just versions of channel. Yeah. So what would happen is the channels would run as simple convolution impulses. They'd be basically working like convolution. I mean, it depends, because the data that I'm working from is based on what I was doing a while back. In fact, back when I was working on 44.1K for everything, before I adapted it to different scenarios. And I did an algorithm where I took the loudest impulse, the impulse that represented whatever device just being slammed, and then I subtracted the quiet impulse and made an equation out of it where quiet sounds would be getting the quiet impulse's convolution, and then as you got louder and louder, it would scale up to the loudest impulse or even beyond that. And I think some of the character stuff gave you exaggerated versions of it. So the idea was sound, and I kind of lost a little of that. When I went to bus colors, I went more like real world and accurately designed. But character was doing it on a sample by sample basis, which this new idea would also be doing it on a sample by sample basis. And then character also let you dial in exaggerated amounts because it was just on a slider. And I had it set up where you could do more than was actually, realistic. And that would be a real interesting thing to include on this. But it would be just on the bus version and not on the channel versions, because the channel versions are just applying the same convolution pattern for subtler stuff. And then the bus version applies the dynamic variation, but it's applying the dynamic variation on the combination of all samples. And it's going to be interesting to see how that works out, but I do feel as if it might be possible to exaggerate the effect. And when you consider that you could be exaggerating the effect and applying it to a completely different console, you could wind up with very inappropriate results. Cue David Tagoye. And I'll doubtless warn people, be careful not to do this because the results that you get might not be sensible because they're designed to work as part of the same equation. And if you're applying this one to the other, it may make no sense whatsoever, and you just get a kind of noisy effect. I don't know. Cue David to go noisy effect, yay. For anybody who is just dialing in, this David Pixley is a friend of mine. It's not as much a personal friend in that it's an internet friend that I've never met, but he's another wild, crazy thinker who comes up with all kinds of ideas and hopefully stopped trolling me as much as he used to. Thank you. And, also, David, bear in mind this, the one that I just put out, since I think you missed my explanation of it. I looked into the code and I discovered that, contrary to my initial belief, Smooth is actually like a slew compressor. So you can exaggerate lows using it and tone down high frequency stuff. And you could also use it in some kind of matrix or subtract it by, you do that and then put in an opposite phase of the original signal and stuff like that. And I suppose you can throw U-Law on it. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I'm sure you're going to find out. I think what would happen if David likes using U-Law on everything, ULaw is like a super hyper console effect in that rather than simply applying a sine curve and then the complementary thing to get the original output back, ULaw applies this crazy exponential curve and then a complementary curve to get the output back. But if you put anything between the ULaw encode and the ULaw decode, it's probably going to produce some really aggressive, ugly noise that's not musical at all. Like incredibly small changes will make incredibly big results if you do that. So, my friend David is really fond of this effect, largely because it does make noisy stuff. It's like if you've ever heard of the Japanese noise artist Merzbow, then that's what we're talking about regarding noisy stuff, is some really aggressively unmusical just blasts of... So don't expect to get normal results if you're doing like that. And that's probably a good point. David points out that doing weird things with just console doesn't get aggressive results. Doing weird things in between instances of ULaw, encode and decode of ULaw, gives really aggressive results. But doing weird things inside console typically won't give you aggressive, noisy results of any kind. So we are about an hour and 10 minutes or so, an hour 15 minutes or so in. Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, that's another thing. And don't let the conversation be completely silenced by this. But yeah, as I am autistic, David is manic depressive and has that sort of horsey to ride, much like I ride the autism horsey. And it's always a little soothing when the manic episode sort of passes off, because usually I wind up not able to respond at all. There's a fair amount of stuff that comes on where people will be filled with ideas and telling me to do stuff, and I'll basically need to just not respond because I have my own things to think about. And David mentioned BeatDruid. BeatDruid is a website. I think maybe I can even link to it because this is my channel and we're on live chat. So let me see whether I can't bring that up, see if it's up and running, which it is, and paste it. This is the thing we're talking about. And that is a wiki. And it is a wiki that I host. It's not very active. People don't really use it because I haven't been using it intensely myself. But, and we can also, I guess we can talk, all of us can talk, certainly me and David can talk about expectations of things like Patreons and stuff. Because I saw some of your plans there. And, I have some stern and stubborn advice about Patreons and things. Because here's your problem. If somebody was being a programmer, and went like, cool, Chris from Air Windows has this Patreon. He's closing in on $1,500 a month. He'll be at above minimum wage before very long, and I should do that too. He has done hundreds of plugins, so I will start doing plugins myself, and then I will get, hundreds of people on my Patreon too. That actually doesn't happen. And it's important to recognize where it comes from. Like the reason that I have a Patreon with X number of people on it is because I went for 10 years running Air Windows as a commercial venture and selling plugins for money. I sold plugins for $50 a pop. That's one of the things that actually helped me with Patreon, because at a certain point, rather than trying to encourage people to chip in $1, the thing of like, oh, this is like my tip jar, so if you can give me $1 a month or buy me a coffee a month, instead of trying to do that, what I did was I started talking about everything in terms of plugins. So I used to sell, I'll get to Zaphor in a moment. I used to sell individual plugins with very decent terms, lifetime support and use it on all your computers and all the terms I currently have, but not the source code yet. And I used to do those for $50 a pop. So what I do now is I talk about the Patreon in terms of that. And I say, if you would have bought one of my plugins this year, if they were being sold for $50, then what you should do is get on the Patreon, if of course that's something you're willing to do, and donate $50 a year as if you were buying one of the plugins, and go from there. If you're using two of them so much that you would have bought them if I was selling them, then please get on the Patreon for 2 plugins, and like that. And expressed in that way, it makes, I think, more sense to people, but it also gives them a context beyond just how many dollars do I want to give Chris just out of the goodness of my own heart. It's more like, okay, how many of these plugins am I constantly using? And it gives them sort of the nudge, like if they are able to do it, and you're using like 5 of my plugins all the time, constantly, then it's like, well, if you were buying those, that would be $250. Some entire plugins cost more than that all by themselves. So, yeah, and most of the people that I deal with as far as my users are concerned aren't in a position to do anything like that. So I'm trying to make stuff that has a context which makes sense, which is like a context where people who can throw $500 this way or that away without even thinking about it. I want something that will make sense to those people, but then also is accessible for people who are like, maybe I can give you $10 if I try really hard. And I'm looking at Zaphor's question and thinking about it. So Zaphor is asking, I've been trying to use PowerSag, not PowerSage, PowerSag, to get this kind of analogish reduction of lows and mid-lows. That means you'd be turning PowerSag's frequency thing up really far and increasing the sag amount of it. I think PowerSag lets you just nuke a lot of that stuff out. I don't think it's that limited. Like, I think if you use PowerSag, you can reduce a heck of a lot in there. It's basically taking an average and then subtracting it. So I think that would work. Unbox wouldn't be affecting that part because Unbox is a distortion. You could try, dare I say it, ULaw. Like use your PowerSag and then either run instances of console, like console channel in front of PowerSag and then console bus after PowerSag. Do that if the subtle amount, which is actually clean and nice sounding, would work. Or you could do ULaw encode, PowerSag, ULaw decode. That's guaranteed to give you crazy violent results that are as aggressive as you could possibly hope for, but it's not going to sound analogish at all. It'll be all the spotlight, but it'll be really nasty sounding. So maybe using console would work for you. Also bear in mind, if you want coloration, you can always use Bus Colors 4 and so Bus Colors 4, PowerSag, and then console 4 bus. Because bus colors 4 is the one where console 4 is designed, you can couple them together so bus colors 4 can replace the console channel 4. So you could use that as part of that combination. It would basically cancel out and be calibrated about right, and then put power sag in the middle of it. You get that? That was what I would suggest that you try. Bus colors 4 into power sag, which is where you're trying to do this reduction of lows and mid lows by using a large frequency and then attenuating. I've also been asked to do a power sag that's also power boost. It wouldn't sound like power boost. It would sound like something else, but it's possible for me to do. And then console 4 bus after it. And that would be my recommendation to use for, is how to get that sounding more analog-ish. Because the thing about it is if you tried to use U-Law, it wouldn't sound analog-ish at all. So Bo is asking, are you better off with Patreon? Less work and steadier income. Less work? I wouldn't call it less work. I was not putting out a plugin a week when I was operating as a commercial venture. And it's definitely less income on the Patreon. That's why I would recommend anybody doing a Patreon, try to run a commercial business on whatever it is that you think you're doing in the first place. Because Patreon will give you less than running an entrepreneurial business and just charging money for stuff. Like, you should be doing that first. Do that first and get it up to the point where you'd be able to switch it over to a Patreon and build up your fan base, build up a customer base, people who know what you're doing. And at that point, you get to switch over to Patreon, and these two things happen. One of the things happens is that you'll be able to give your stuff away like YouTubers do. And YouTubers like do their shows and stuff, and that's just available to be watched. That, I think, is it is a taste of one kind of future. It's an economy of attention rather than an economy of money. And currently we're operating with both of them at the same time. So to survive Patreon, you have to simultaneously be doing the economy of attention and also surviving in the economy of money, which is the super challenging part. But if you can do the commercial venture thing enough to survive with that, then going to Patreon means that you'll be able to start giving your stuff away and open sourcing it, doing that more cooperative thing, and basically trying to make it up in volume. The other thing that happens is, as long as Patreon or something like it, meaning a processing system that does the same thing and is popular enough that people recognize it, like they recognize something like PayPal, and can be convinced to engage with it in the way that they engage with my Patreon, that kind of sort of crowdfunding patronage thing is smoother than working as an entrepreneurial thing. Like, I can show you, I could show you the actual pictures because I've got those, but this would be my income from working as a commercial vendor over the course of several years. Actually, and we'll say like, okay, and this sold fairly well, this sold fairly well. I had a hit here, and then it dwindled, and then it hit here, and then everybody was pirating the stuff from here at this point, so I got 0 for this month. And then I made another hit, and then I made a big hit, and then things were derping around for a while, not being very exciting. Oh, look, another hit. Patreon would look like this. Patreon income would look like this. At no point is it more money than the commercial venture, but it is less unpredictable. You have less capacity for just crashing out completely. And it sort of steadily builds. And that's more manageable. as far as running a business is concerned, if you have a fairly decent chance of knowing what your income is going to be over the next month, you can plan more easily. You can work out what you're going to do, what you're going to invest in. Like, I need a better camera. This is still a Logitech webcam. You build up these things, and you can see, like, okay, I've got the Logitech webcam, but I have the occasional like $70 to $140 modular synthesizer stuff, because that's also part of what I'm doing. My God, Chris has nailed it. It is income slew rate compression in every sense, because it's also compressing the way that your money can collapse. If you have a really crappy month or you get sick, your income is probably not all going to evaporate very suddenly. It takes time for it to drain away, just as it takes time for it to build up. And that's incredibly valuable. Because with time, you can adapt to things. You can make your plans. You can adjust your lifestyle in such a way to, it's just less stressful, and it gives you the opportunity to engage with stuff on that sort of open source front. Again, you kind of have to build up the user base. You have to build up the customer base first. I don't think you can do this out of nowhere. I think you have to build it to where you could take a half, build it to where you can at least have your income and still survive. Probably more, but, and it also depends upon where you can scramble for help. Like, my mom and dad were alive while I was trying to get the Patreon launching off the ground. If they were not, I don't think I would have survived. I don't think I would have made it. I'm not sure what would have happened. It wouldn't be good. But I'm missing a Zophor question, so let's have a look. Yeah, David, I would like to encourage you not to have this doom-laden kind of stuff. Some of your friends are very doom-laden kind of people, and I relate to that because I'm in recovery, so a bunch of my friends are like recovering drug addicts, and so I've had a lot of my friends die. Maybe not quite the same way, but in some ways kind of similar to how some of your friends have died. But that just doesn't sound like, I would not be planning to be homeless. I would be planning to... you're not thinking community-wise here. Like this stuff here that I'm highlighting. You are not thinking in terms of building up a community that cares about you, because you probably have no context for that whatsoever, and neither did I. But if I was looking at becoming homeless because of my stuff was collapsing super hard or some terrible thing happened to me, there's a lot of people out there who know who I am, who have put up with some of my ups and downs and things like that, and I've worked to try to be worthy of them. And it establishes a relationship. Like, we are in a world that is dictated by what you could call late-stage capitalism, in which your value is literally how much money you could generate, but that's not necessarily the natural state of human beings. Human beings like to make communities. Human beings like to look out for each other. We are social animals. And as such, if you say something like, you can say, I expect to be working at Walmart in a few years, and that basically says, I don't intend to accumulate any money. You could be meaning, like, I'm going to buy modular synthesizer gear. Like, I could easily blame myself for that attitude. And therefore, I'll have done all of this. I'll have no money for rent or utilities or anything like that, so I'm going to be working at Walmart. That is, of course, assuming that the thing that you're spending money on is not becoming popular in some kind of way and giving you a chance at stuff. But the talking about becoming homeless is like saying, in a few years, I will have gone through all of my friends. And I would suggest to you that that is not the way to go. Instead, connect with people. You're showing up on my streams. You have this whole Pixelgasm thing, which is another set of friends. Some of them are also very rootless and despairing and so on. And I get that. I get that, but it is not the natural way of human beings to just let each other go that way. We shall see. I'll put you to work soldering stuff. That'd be a terrifying prospect. David Pixley living under my roof. I wouldn't get any sleep because he'd be like, make this new thing. Or sitting in a chair for days, staring at the wall. I understand some of the mental kind of stuff with the autism. I have my own challenges to go through. Anyways, I was really looking towards skip forward a little bit. Walkthrough. Yeah, that's something. Before I scroll down some more, or we'll get into that in a moment. You're looking at how to set up multiple tracks. I'm writing walkthrough. We'll get back to that as soon as we finish this current conversation, which is touching on some other things. The plugin to Vinyl that has Groover does not have power sag. Power sag is not a mastering grade type thing. It's just a noise effect. Console systems. Yeah, the challenge with live streams is you really have to become a media personality. And there are a lot of people trying to do that who have nothing else. So that's, look at me. I have a lot going on. I make many things for many people, but it is not my streaming that gives me Patreon and all of that. It would be nice if that helps contribute to it. I'm certainly trying to get better at it and be doing stuff that people can relate to, because it's another way of connecting with people rather than sort of staying behind a mask and releasing plugins incognito. I kind of have to be able to connect with people in that way as well. That's the other side of it. It's like what I was just telling David, is I'm doing plugins so that people can see me, so that people can know what I'm trying to do and get to know me as a person. Many YouTubers, all they are is you get to know them as a person as they play video games or whatever. I do a lot of other work and I make things for people, but you also get to know me as a person. And that'll be a kind of safeguard if things get tough on me or if something happens where I need to reach out to that. And it's also, clearly it can be its own kind of thing. I've always been so reclusive as an autistic person that just thinks about plugins and audio and stuff that, I'd rather, this morning, rather than hang out with friends online or something like that, I was reprogramming the Axolotl, that little thing on the perf board there. And what I was doing was changing its chord change thing in so that it cycles through a series of chords, and I had rethought the kinds of chords I wanted to have it change to. Technically keys. It does a key change thing. But I thought of some new chord sequences, and instead of using, I had entered in 4-chord song, and I had entered in 2 different ways. One of them was 8 chords, which was the 4-chord song, and then repeated, and then repeating each of the chords once, and that filled up the 8 as well. And I decided I didn't want to have any of the things like that. Instead, I was going to have just those 4 chords and then a series of follow-up chords after that. And if I wanted to do the 4-chord song stuff, I would just set it to 4 things repeating and not use the full 8. And I just decided that it needed to do that. So that was what I was doing this morning. I could have gotten a little more sleep if I had chosen not to do that, but I have spent a lot of time just digging into things like that and not socializing, not talking with or being with people at all. And I think a non-autistic person would have gone completely bonkers, which is not to say I haven't gone completely bonkers. But we're not really meant to be that isolated. I naturally become that isolated, and I've used it for my work, but it's not a good picture of how people normally are. And I can't assume that other people are going to automatically be the same way I am and take no interest in how I'm doing or not want to spend any time with me or talk or hang out with me or anything like that just because that's the way I normally act. I have to acknowledge that other people, think and act and behave differently. So yeah, a few thoughts on streams and things. I got to scroll down because David is talking. Performance levels, explanations, and things. Yeah. That's the challenge is with the streams. It's like audience is not the same thing as patrons. Sometimes audience is way huger than patrons. And as far as doing what you love and making albums from dither noise, remember there is already a Mertzbo. So come up with your own flavor of whatever it is and then see where it takes you. I mean, I know Mertzbo as a name, and I've listened to some of his music that I don't really gravitate to listening to his music on a regular basis because it's just a little too aggressive for me. Bear in mind, David, that I do like doing walkthroughs. That's why I started doing this Monday stream in the first place. Okay, David, then you have more than I do, and you should be especially cautious about that kind of talk because I've always considered that sort of thing as a heck of an obligation. In some ways, it's one of my resources that I am laboring without any kind of connection of that sort. I mean, even my cat died last year. I've got nothing. And that means that I am a lot less attached to things and can take bigger risks. And, I do have friends, so I can't take all the biggest risks in the world. But when you're talking about, like, I have a cat, therefore I must be able to afford cat food and stuff like that because I consider that a responsibility. If I ended up with a girlfriend or wife or something like that, I have some pretty strong feelings regarding being essentially a pinko commie socialist type of person and not motivating myself towards building a massive wealth and leaving it to my heirs. That is not how I see my world being. But I wouldn't be comfortable endangering somebody else's world by just being overly casual about what kind of poverty I was willing to accept if there was somebody else involved. So that is kind of how I see that. Regarding the screen capture during Q&As, that's one of the reasons I write stuff on paper all the time is because I'd like to be able to show people something. But also, I'm not doing my music in the DAW. I'm making plugins, and I'm making plugins all the time, and it's very interesting, but my litmus test is never other DAW stuff. My litmus test is not about like this that I could do in the DAW. I'm always referencing to analog music in many, many ways. I'm using digital reverbs, but they're not at any given sample rate. They're just sort of this and that and whatever, different filters and things on them. And I got a lot of synthesizers. Hey, Bernard. And I've got analog instruments. Like I've got the Rhodes. That's very nice. I am very tempted to work towards getting myself other decent analog instruments. And by that, I mean either maybe a clavi or no, I haven't updated the floating point dither yet. Things are still unfolding, then that is a very big task. I'll let people know when I'm done. So either a clavi, a Hohner clavinet, those are amazing. Or perhaps like one of the, I think there's a Korg CX3. There's a Hammond organ synthesizer, which is actually very nice. It doesn't have the best Leslie emulation in the world, but It's not a digital emulation. It is a analog Hammond thingy. And I need to look that up again as well, because I'm thinking in terms of like trying to stack things on top of the Rhodes. Incorporate stuff. You might notice that the Farfisa organ that was there is now not there anymore. And I decided that although I'm really happy with a lot of the noises that it makes, I'm going to see what I can do with the Sox boxes and things instead. Certainly next live stream tomorrow. I bet this one is still labeled music stream, isn't it? Let's go and see. Yep, I lie. It's not music. It's Q&A. I'll get back to it, and there we go. We're updating that. I meant to do that, but there's always many things that I have to remember for all this stuff, and I make little notes for myself all the time, but it's still very difficult keeping track of it all. It's, streaming and recording and mixing and managing all of the different inputs and outputs and stuff. So yeah, somebody mentioned Vocaloid, I think. Yeah, I never actually did go any farther on the suitcase modular. I just still have the suitcase for it. It would be interesting, but probably what I'm going to do is I have this, long ago I was able to get this piece of studio furniture. It's an Argosy V90, I think, or V70 maybe. No, maybe it's a V90. Generic console with 2 rack bays and a center area, and the computer is sitting on the center area, and speakers are balancing precariously on the rack bays because they're the mastering style where the back end sort of tilts back. I need to get new rack bays for these, the ones that extend all the way down to the edge here. I'll end up having to figure out new stuff like where to put my mouse, but that's where I would want to put the massive quantity of perf board styled homebrewed, like the homebrewed mixing board. I want to replace this Roland with a mixing board that I built myself with my own summing, my own hardware summing, and dedicated modules for various things. So that is a goal. That is definitely a goal. Hardware compressor. The funny thing is I'm not using hardware compressors much. Like, I've got a signal put into this MIDI verb where one of my AUXes on the Roland is driving an LED, and the LED also has a capacitors on it so that it'll smooth out its blinking according to the signal, and that is against some CDS cells, so I've made myself some little back trolls, and those are shorting out the output of the reverb, so that makes sidechain compression for me. But it's a really weird, screwy kind of sidechain compression that works, but it's just very sketchy. As far as hardware compressors, I'm more likely to be using those on guitars and things. And I do have a favorite guitar compressor, which is an Analog Man juicer. That is a pretty expensive boutique pedal. And the thing about that is it is a emulation of I'm trying to remember the name of the guy, Dan Armstrong Orange Squeezer. And that Orange Squeezer is the kind of compressor that Mark Knopfler was using on guitars. And I've tried and have not even gotten close to getting anything like a Mark Knopfler style compressed guitar tone. So I've basically given up. Maybe if I worked at it a little harder or set things up differently, I'd be able to work that out. In any case, the Analog Man Juicer is a guitar pedal that I heartily endorse. I've tried various different kinds of guitar compressors, and not all of them are very good. There's one called the Fairfield Accountant that is a very beautiful little compressor. It's a tiny little thing with these hammered in labels on the actual aluminum of the thing. Unfortunately, it's so miniaturized that it has built all of its analog circuitry into this microscopic form with these SMD components, and I couldn't get any bass. I couldn't use it for a bass because it wouldn't put any bass out. It was too small. The bits in it were too small. Whereas I can show you something interesting. Give me a second. I'll be right back. We'll do something fun. We've got a screwdriver and I am not necessarily taking apart the Analog Man juicer, but this is a Analog Man Beano Boost, and I'll show you what the insides of it look like. And I do not have the Fairfield Accountant still, because I sold it, to cross-reference, but it'll show you some of the things I'm talking about, and I try not to move the dials on this or anything. I try to keep it as it is, because this is what I'm going to try to learn from with regard to making my modular synthesizer stuff. And any guitar pedals that I do make, which I could do, if I was doing that, they would start getting priced like Analog Man things and whatever, or auctioned, because that becomes the I only have so much time to spend wiring stuff up. I do have some of the tools that I would need for doing this type of work. For instance, I have a drill press, so I would be able to drill holes in a box cleanly and effectively. I'm not sure what else I would do. I've done some exploring with how one would do that. So have a little look at how this is built. It's not quite the same as I thought, but what we've got in here is capacitors, including one very large one in here. It might actually be multiple capacitors for all I know. This, see, I actually need different glasses for being able to see this very clearly. It's just a big blur. But we've got turret board inside here. It is the stuff that used to be made to wire up tube amplifiers. And you've got heavy solid wires. This is a fairly heavy wire in here, going from the jacks to various bits. And individual resistors and things are soldered between these turrets on the turret boards. There's no printed circuit traces anywhere in here. All of the traces inside this box are heavier than what you would find on a printed circuit board. It's all point-to-point wiring. And the wires inside there are fairly heavy stuff. And we've got this new old stock transistor. That's one of the things Analog Man does, is he's got all of these different transistors and things available. And you can buy things like a fuzz face from him with multiple different kinds of transistors. This capacitor is a axial capacitor. I think that's, yeah, axial capacitor with sort of the canister with connections on either end. It's very old school, that. And again, all these wires are really heavy wires. This is how you wire stuff up to sound good. And it has been out of, oh, and check it out. Signed. Because that's how Analog Man rolled. That's how this stuff works. And there's that little stamp there. He's got a stamp for it. Now let me see. I do believe it goes back. No, does it? No, it'll go back together this way. There we go. Because the Velcro is only in one place. I do have hopes of setting up that pedal board better, because what I'm lacking is the connectors. My cables are terrible there. The cables are letting me down. They're just a bunch of little patch cords, and they're all different lengths, and it's just not a great setup. If I can replace all the cables with stuff that is like cut to length and especially the size that it needs, that would be a big improvement. But yeah, what I use as far as tube stuff is concerned is a small Epiphone Valve Junior amp. That is a tube guitar amp, but it's a very small one. And it's not very fancy. I do everything with the pedals rather than the amp. Even so, it gets me more than enough gain and distortion that I might want, and it gives a good loud guitar sound for the little speaker that I'm miking. I've also got a couple of transformers over there. I'm pointing at them. And those were bought from, I think, Weber. And they are reverb driver transformers. The reason I got them, and I've got them out now so that I can fool with them, is because I found the cheapest transformer you can get for powering tube output circuits. This particular one is a Weber transformer that has a very small output winding and a fairly large, like I think 25K or something like that, input winding. It's a fairly high impedance input. And it's for driving reverb tanks. My idea is I actually intend to use that with FETs or transistors, but most likely FETs, not transistors per se, not bipolar transistors, and using them as part of the hardware mixing desk I'm going to be trying to build. Because if I can make that will give me balanced outputs, so I'll be able to run the outputs of whatever the mixing desk is to anything I want. I've got like balanced inputs for audio capture, and I've got balanced balanced amplifiers. Everything is. What the name of this pedal? This pedal is a Beano Boost. Beano Boost. It's named after the Eric Clapton album, the Blues Breakers album that was called the Beano album because he was reading a comic book that said Beano on it. And that was an album where Clapton was using a device much like this and was one of the first people to get like your modern ripping distorted guitar sound rather than just like plunk. Let me keep an eye out on some of this. I've made guitar pedals with the transformer before, although I'm not Neve. Transformers make a bunch of a difference. Honestly, people have been very worried about getting away from the sonic differences produced by transformers, because when people want to like, oh, super extended high frequencies, or oh, let's give all the bass, then usually they don't want transformers because transformers have that bandpass quality. They're very good and very clean at doing certain things, but they're not going to pass highs past a certain amount, and they're not going to pass lows past a certain amount. That's one reason why. Let me go and grab that. I'll show you the transformer I have in mind. Oh, it's raining like mad out there. In fact, let me go and grab some of the telephone coupling transformers while I'm at it. You can compare. Let's grab all of them. Somebody was looking for the specifics on these. I can show you my notes. Then you can do a screen grab and have some of my information. So here's different boxes of transformers. This, and these are all the kind that I was going to use for, like, these are like yay big. Triad TY300P. This is a 600 ohm primary coil that'll take 4 watts apparently, and then there's 2 outside coils. And I think they don't make these anymore, but these are, I think the one that I'm using is actually one like this, unless it's the other kind. And I got TY300PR, and I got TY300P. These are made by Triad, and again, the connection is like this, and it is 3 coils, not 2, not center tapped, 3 coils. Then we have, hang on, I'm going to keep one of these out for this reason. High-Q 8809. As you can see, the high-Q is physically larger. That's going to let it pass more base through if you're using it like a normal transformer is used. With regard to the magnetodynamic infundibulator, that matters less, but it's going to still shift the whole tone of the thing down. High-Q 8809 is also a 3, and the pinout is exactly the same. It's wired up the same way. As you can see, it's larger. If you were going to use this as the output of something, you'd be able to get a little more lows out of this one. But they're still not really designed for anything all that impressive. They're still telephone coupling transformers. They're not meant to do super low frequencies. Whereas, this is the Hammond, or the Weber. So this is not a 3-coil transformer, it's a 2-coil transformer. This one tiny one is like this, and then the second tiniest one. And this one has these big old heavy wires. It's meant to be wired into a tube amplifier. No, actually, it would make your guitar sound terrible because this is tiny for a guitar amplifier, but it's for driving a reverb tank. So it's for driving a coil that powers the reverb tank and putting a goodly number of watts through that. For that reason, if you took like this tiny one and try to use that as the output of your entire mixing board, you'd get a good balanced signal because it would be a coil on the outside. Just like this has a low impedance coil, even lower than that. David, that might not be a real person. That might be just somebody trolling. Whereas this one, it's got a much larger core and coils inside it, and it's handling a higher output, so it'll be able to reach down lower into the bass if you have the output of a amplifier being part of your mixing board. I think that'll conclude. I wanted to show you this compared to these because I picked this out because this is the cheapest tube amp style transformer you can get. It still does the thing of like 25K input impedance and very, very small output impedance. So it can drive outputs like mad. It's very good at that. And it is significantly larger than this, but this will cost about $1.39 and this will cost about $20. And you just kind of work that stuff out. But the idea is picking something that'll work for the context required. And that's why for the magnetodynamic infundibulator, you can use the telephone coupling transformers because you're going straight through them. But if you're using it as the actual output stage, that's when you start having to use larger, physically larger, heavier transformers in order to get power, bass, and intensity through it. And there is an example that if you're familiar with amplifiers, like Fenders, Marshalls, stuff like that, 2 amplifiers that are known for very big, powerful output transformers is a Fender Twin and also a High Watt. And High Watt is known for extremely enormous output and coupling transformers. And one of the things that happens with High Watt amps is they're unbearably, impossibly loud, but extremely clear. You can distort them, but it just, you hook up the speakers and it just hits you with this enormous wall of power and force. You can have a similar amount of distortion on something with a smaller transformer like some of the Marshalls, and it's a little softer, it's a little spongier, it's a different flavor. So if I was doing a mix and I wanted the mix to have powerful bass and drums and things coming through it, and I was using the output coil to get my balanced out, what I would be doing is picking something like this, picking something like a reverb tank output transformer that's capable of driving a reverb tank driver, and then using that simply for a line output. It's overpowered. It will produce more energy than I need, but that means it'll have more dynamics. So it is 1:01. I'm going to be winding down, and I think just in time too, because depending upon whether there are more people who randomly show up and have a dead body in their room, so they go on YouTube and join somebody's stream, because that makes sense. That's the kind of thing where sometimes they have to put it back on Top Chat, but it looks like we didn't have to do that this time around. We'll see. And Bernard has in fact found that, and David, that is how you spell FETs. F-E-T, and it's field effect transistor is what that is about. And yep, I think a last question I have here, unless people start firing new questions at me all of a sudden, is a pedal that could load VSTs. Well, here's the thing. I have done some things, like I'll grab another thing. I guess sometimes I'm jumping up and grabbing things a lot. Like what I use for home brewing stuff is one of these. And you can use it for a guitar pedal too. This is an Axolotl developer board. It has a place where you can put your little memory card here. And that's where you can save its little program. And these are guitar inputs and outputs. Like you can plug a guitar into here and get a guitar level out of here. In fact, I believe it's stereo. And then it's got MIDI, so you can dial that in, and you program it going on the computer and making a sort of flow chart out of these various. It's one of your point-to-point node-based design a program by dragging noodles between boxes kind of thing. And you can use that to do algorithms, including ones at a fairly low level. It's a fairly powerful little device. There are some limitations, however, and it's not going to run actual VSTs. You're looking for a computer to run VSTs, because VSTs are very DAW-oriented, they're very computer-oriented. And one of the problems with that, like with this, your latency is going to be what you decide it's going to be. It's capable of running pretty fast. It will run with buffers, but it's not necessarily going to have to do a lot else besides just that. But if you're going into a computer, you could have any number of other things happening that's contributing to latency. And yeah, what this is called is written on it, Axolotl. I strongly encourage these guys. This is made by a company out of Belgium, and it's super cool. I'm currently using it to drive my entire modular rig there. The center brain of it is an Axolotl, and it is providing a whole bunch of relatively low-powered trigger outputs and also MIDI output. And it's got a USB thing which is connected to a Korg Nano Control, and it You can plug any Korg nano control into this and then use all of the Korg's knobs and things within the programming of this, which is what I'm doing. Or indeed any MIDI class compliant device. And there could be further things that I do about that. So final quick questions, as this is hopping and rolling. Best mic for live shows, that's a very easy answer. Point to SM57 at your tank drum. You'll be good. Put it nice and close. Focus it right in. There is nothing so good as an SM57 for spotlighting a sound and having it be nice and clear and good sounding, especially in a live context. It has really decent off-axis rejection. It doesn't squeal like condenser mics would. And if you point it at a thing, it gets nice clarity and detail out of that thing. So yeah, get an SM57. For something live, you can't go wrong. And a tank drum will sound lovely with an SM57. Just mic it nice and close and you're good. So our chat is moving nice and zippy, so let's see what I can do to finish this off. Do it if you want to. I think I even have that as an SVG file. Let's find out. That's one thing that's worth noting. Where are we? Yep. If you right click on my image of the dog in the Air Windows website and open it as its own image, you'll get this. And that is an SVG file. An SVG file is a vector file. That image could be scaled to put on your car if you wanted. It's not quantized, shall we just say. That is a vector image. So if you wanted to put it anywhere you wanted and say I use Air Windows plugins, that gives you a lot of opportunities for that. That is a high resolution, Tony. That SVG file is any resolution you want it to be. If you don't have that working out, then open it in Illustrator or Inkscape or something like that, or figure out some way of doing it. But the SVG file is any resolution you like. You're welcome. And if you haven't been able to do it by next week, then come back and tell me I wasn't able to get the SVG file to work, and I'll work it through with you and figure out something. But yeah, I can. Oh, no, that's actually changing the size of the chat, which will be useful in its own way. I can expand the SVG file to 300% in the browser, and it is still completely perfect resolution on high DPI, mind you. That's one of the great things about SVGs, is that they're really good for that vector stuff. It's the same as an Illustrator file. I didn't put Air Windows with it. I might want to use a different font someday or whatever. No, it's just the dog. If you're placing it somewhere, then you probably have the ability to place vector text as well. So pick whatever text you want. I'm not sure whether I should be looking up what font it is. Let me take a minute and do that. As long as we're derping around, going over time, I might as well. And there's no such thing as overtime. It's just that if I was specifying a particular goal to get to, in which I agree to do 3-hour streams, then that would be a thing. And so I'm not going to do 3-hour streams until I get to that point. So that's Tools, Web Developer, Inspector. So let's see. I got logo. So Class logo text. I'm trying to work out what font that is. For practical purposes, SVG is not quantized. So yeah, I believe that the Air Windows on my website seems to be drawn in Open Sans, but you can also use Helvetica, and that'll work out. And the logo is in fact my work. I drew that. I drew it and made it into an SVG. And yes, you are free to save questions and things on beachdruid.com. Feel free to go to work on it. I will keep it up and running as long as I possibly can, and there's no reason to think I'm going to have problems with that now. Should be able to hang out with there. So yeah, Open Sans or Helvetica Nieuwe. Those two are what I've got Air Windows written in. So fit it around there somewhere, and that would look about right. Anyways, I think we're getting to be about done. So, boop. I like it. It's a piss take on the RCA Nipper logo, because of course, famously, back in the day and during some of the highlights of recorded sound, I'm super tempted to run off and grab even more records now. Just a moment. Haven't quite left, so I'm going to see whether I can't find something over here that's fun to show you. Namely, okay, that's an LM. I could end up doing Wednesday streams for classical records, not just regular records. This is not one of the most desirable, but RCA, LSC, Living Stereo, what are called, this is an RCA Victor, and these are called shaded dogs. Not because the record is a dog because it's so bad, but because the label has this on it. It's a stereo record with this little shaded part, and it shows the dog listening to the gramophone. It says his master's voice. That is where the idea for the Air Windows logo comes from, because I'm a rock and roller and make really crazy experimental music, so my dog is trying to cover his ears and is hiding from the noise. But it's based on the idea of Nipper and the shaded dog, and this is an example of one of your really good sounding vinyl records. It gets good and solid. It's not too flimsy. It is just, it's not so old that it is really tinny and mono, although you'd be surprised. I mean, some of the oldest mono records can still be amazing in certain ways. Like, you'll find that with incredibly old 78s and stuff, there are certain things about, say, piano noises, piano tones and things like that. It's going to be very band limited, especially the stuff that's like acoustically recorded, not even electrically recorded. That stuff is incredibly band limited. It has no bass, it has no treble, it's all scratchy and stuff. But the rawness of the sound transduction, the ways in which the generation of the record is done in these incredibly primitive ways gives this involvement. And I think that is because of peak energy, and less that sort of diminishes the peak energy. In terms of things like loudness war and stuff, old 78s are like the opposite of that in a peculiar way. not because they have good signal to noise ratio, but because the sound that is being captured, like the hottest peaks, get through the process with a minimum amount of distortion, electrical saturation, tube amp saturation, all that kind of stuff. So it winds up with this very spiky, thin kind of sound, which has a lot of involvement to its quality. Overtones jump out. Also, the sound gets scrubbed away on the vinyl unless it is a fairly large transient. So there's that. And of course, something like this, old living stereo. This is 50s, 1960s. I think it's more 50s. Tube amplifiers for all the record cutting and everything. No digital delay as part of the record thing. Instead, they just had to kind of wing it. They didn't have the sophisticated ways of getting more runtime onto the surface of the record. They just got what they got. And some of this stuff sounds wonderful. If we get up to that 1500 point, I'll be showing you some of these records, and I will include some of the classical records if you like. But for now, I should go and have some lunch or something. Silly. Okay, we're getting sillier and sillier people onto the stream. So, in lieu of turning it over to Top Chat, we'll just say goodnight. So, talk to you later. And I'll be doing a little music jam tomorrow. See you then.